Friends, colleagues, and listeners, here we are. We've got a great podcast for you today. And it's one of those subject matters that you sort of take for granted. You think, oh, okay. But then when you think about it, it's got a lot of interesting angles to it. So I've got the guest, which is our guest, rather, which is Dr. Campbell Waddell. And Campbell, is it all right if I call you Campbell?
Of course, yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks for having me, Chris. Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you, sir. And Campbell is the MD for R3. Now, R3 stands for Roads, Runways and Racetracks, okay, which is a lovely, lovely little combination, and that's what grabbed my interest. So what I'd like to know, first of all, Campbell, and also the doctor, because of the PhD, but how did you come to become the MD of R3, and what was it that attracted you to that particular organisation? And if you can let the listeners know just exactly what R3 does briefly, that would be fantastic.
Sure. So R3. I've goes back a while. I started working, particularly with airports, about 12 years ago, 15 years ago, when I started working for a company called Finlay Irvine, who make friction testers and weather monitoring systems for airports. And that's where I started to get interested in it. And as part of that, my mentor and co-founder of R3, Dr. David Woodward from Ulster University. We were actually going to Cork to do a presentation. He's a grip tester user, so I went across to help him and ended up driving down from Belfast to Cork with him to do a presentation on friction testing to the students there. And David's got a big interest in Formula One, as do I.
Right. Yeah.
And we ended up speaking about Formula One the whole way down and got on really well. And then later that year, Ulster University had a partnership with Abu Dhabi Motorsport Management, who run Yas Marina.
Yep.
Track.
I used to live there.
Ah, beautiful part of the world.
I used to live there, yeah. Al Bandar, overlooking Yas Island.
Ah, yes, yeah. So yes, you'll know it very well.
Yep.
So we went there in 2012 to do a friction testing project where we basically came up with a system for measuring the grip of racetracks. Off the back of that, we wrote a paper which was published, and then that then led on to a PhD, which was advertised and nobody took it. So one night at a conference, after a couple of drinks with Davey, he persuaded me to do the PhD part-time. So I did my PhD part-time looking at the grip of motorsport surfaces.
Yeah,
where
brilliant.
we took a transfer of knowledge from airports and roads and applied it to motorsport. Because it turns out that they don't do much with grip. They don't do any sort of measurements. There's no real standard for it. So yeah, I did that over 5 years while working with Finlay Irvine still, and training. I was technical supervisor and manager for Finlay Irvine for a while, and basically looked after all their training, teaching people how to use the grip tester. So worked at airports across the world. And yeah, basically did my PhD around the Singapore Grand Prix. So we developed the measurement system for it. And then off the back of that, we decided that we needed to do something with it. And we, with our other co-founder, Nick Morley from Road Grip, the three of us started R3. And that's where it came from. So we have a partnership with Ulster University, where we can basically, our remit is to commercialize their research laboratory. So we have a specialist non-standard testing laboratory in Ulster University, and we do specialist testing for roads, runways and racetracks.
Fantastic. I'll tell you, this is really spooky because I said to you, I'm just doing a project, and I've just met a Scottish Australian called Mark Campbell, and what a character he is. It's been an absolute pleasure. Then I find out that you did that project in Cork, and my family come from West Cork, down near the Mizzen Head. And then you're saying in 2012, I was actually working for Etihad in 2012, and I used to do the walk and the cycle ride every Tuesday night around the Yas Marina, and then end up in Stars and Stripes afterwards. And ironically, I think it was in 2009 or 2010, part of the annual conference with Etihad was all about Formula One and about how it's developed with the pit stops.
Yep.
And it was amazing. So lot of coincidence there. The only thing I don't have is I don't have a PhD.
Well, we can get you one if you want one. If you want to do a PhD,
Yeah,
we're always looking for people.
who knows? Maybe. But as far as the international and independent testing consultancy, okay, can you just explain a little bit about, and especially the runways, obviously, because that's something I'm really interested in. Now, the exercise you did in Cork, which was probably unique because they closed the whole runway down whilst you were doing it. Do you just want to explain a little bit about the milling and about the camber issues and about, also about the machine controls and all the elements that go into it? Because I don't think when anybody's sitting on an aircraft getting ready to take off or land, they actually know exactly what goes into all of that process and what also saves money, what makes the runway, even better. So, you've got all the issues with tires and brakes and everything. Do you want to just give us a little bit of an insight into that?
Sure, yeah. So, I mean, you drive on roads every day, you land on runways every day. You don't really think about the boring black stuff that you're landing on. But as well as specialist testing that we do, we also provide consultancy services for construction of asphalt and construction of roads and runways. So yeah, when you're constructing a runway in particular, there's a lot of things you have to consider, such as the bearing capacity, the loads that it's going to have to take. So the material has to be specially chosen. You ship an aggregate from specialist sources and quarries, which is mixed with polymer modified bitumen to create the asphalt material. And the spec has to be specially written and designed so that the materials are suitable for the climate that you're in. So what works in Abu Dhabi doesn't necessarily work in Cork, and you need to adapt it accordingly. And obviously, obviously to create an asphalt and a material that's going to last 15, 20 years, which is what you want to get out of a runway. You need to make sure it's constructed to the highest possible standards. So you need good levels of quality control. You need the right contractor. And on Cork, we were brought in by Colas, who were the contractor, to help with that. So we work with a company called Topcon. We have a system and a workflow called Smooth Ride. And we do their LiDAR scanning for them. So we basically use the LiDAR scanner to scan the existing runway. We then use that scan to place it into the software that we have with the design of the runway that was done by the designers. And from that, we created a very variable milling plan, which allowed the runway to be reprofiled and to reduce the amount of asphalt material that was used during construction. Because rather than the traditional way is just to mill off the existing surface to a set level, and then top it up, replace other a binder course and then a friction course on top, a surface course on top. With this, what we did was we allowed them to do variable milling, so they could take off certain sections at the edges to then raise them to reprofile it to create a smoother runway, so that it becomes more structurally sound and a better handling ride for aircraft landing on it, and drains water better. So we use the software, which then basically the LiDAR scan produces a file which goes into machine control for the milling machine and automates the process. So it takes out some of the human error and creates a smoother surface.
Brilliant. And what you said there about, and I think most people, when they watch television and they look at football or rugby pitches, they don't realise that there's a camber, and the way if you're able to sit right on the edge and look across, you don't realise how I don't know whether you say it high or whatever it is, but it's a substantial difference, isn't it?
Yeah. So for example, every runway is slightly different, every road's slightly different, but generally speaking, you have a crown in it, so it'll peak in the middle, allowing water to flow off the sides. And then for runways, we tend to use grooving, so diamond cut grooves to basically create a macro texture into the surface, which allows water drainage, but also increases the friction. And a typical Formula One track, for example, would have a minimum of a 1% cross slope across it at all times, so that water doesn't just sit in the texture of the surface, it then flows off, and it allows it to drain faster. And that's particularly important for a runway, because you have a lot of rubber going down in touchdown zones, and when that gets wet, it becomes very slippy. And so airport operators need to be ensuring that rubber is removed, and they want the runways to dry as quickly as possible, so that they can they can have safer landing.
And when you say the rubber being moved, which is another being removed, I mean that's another element that people don't realise as well. Because every time the tires touch down, a percentage of it is left on the runway.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So it builds up quite rapidly. If you're ever landing and you look down or you use the cameras in the planes, you'll see it. Or when you turn off, where you tend to have the touchdown zones just after the piano keys, thick with rubber, and that has to be removed. So one of the services that we do as well is friction testing, which in the UK, for example, you have to do every 11 months. The big airports will do it weekly. So Heathrow, for example, will do it potentially weekly. And that monitors the level of rubber that's there. And then there's special high pressure water machines that can be deployed and used to remove the rubber without damaging the surface.
Yeah, no, it's amazing. Something just come to my mind now. It might have been ACI, but wasn't there a global focus on runway, like a health check on runways that was done? Was it last year or 2 years ago?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah.
And what was what sort of results came from that exercise?
Yeah, I think they found that that runways are, generally speaking, runway legislation from ICAO, it's just then brought down to each civil aviation authority, is pretty standard, but there's slight differences. I think they found that I can't remember what the specific report said, but there was differences in runway conditions across the globe and across the world. But generally speaking, conditions were improving, and there was a need for more standardized testing to be done at a consistent level, so that airport operators could be confident that their runways and surfaces are suitable for the type of planes and aircraft they have landing and the number of movements they have.
Yeah, that was very, very positively and politically correct the way you answered that one.
Thanks.
I would put it that there was a huge concern at the disparity in certain airports and certain regions, which is, I mean, it's worrying, but it's also now it brings into perspective what you guys do and how important it is.
Absolutely. I mean, the importance of standardized testing and testing regularly. So looking at things like surface condition monitoring, essentially. Yeah. Your runway as an airport is your biggest asset. Yeah. Without that, then everything else is obsolete. So you need to keep that runway in perfect condition, and the way to reduce whole life operating costs is to use standard testing methods for surface condition monitoring, which then allow you to program preventative maintenance and extend the life of the runway material that you have, rather than having to, say, resurface or overlay every 2 years like they do in some countries.
Exactly.
It's bad for the environment, it's bad for safety, it's bad for your business, and it's unnecessary.
But why do they allow that?
It's just the way it's historical. It's just the way things have gone, particularly in some of the developing countries. I know there's countries out there, particularly in Asia, where, for example, they'll overlay every 2 years rather than do preventative maintenance, and that's just because, and it's no excuse, but it's the way they've always done it. There's a lack of expertise, a lack of understanding around the systems, and once you get that system in place for standardized testing, and you start to use that properly. So there's 4 main test methods that you can use for non-destructive and structural testing. So heavyweight deflectometer to measure the structural capacity and bearing capacity of the runway. If you do that every 2-3 years, depending on the size of the runway, that will tell you that it's what loads it can take and the condition of the substructures. Then you have PCI, pavement condition index, which will produce a PCN, which gives you a breakdown. It's a visual survey of the runway, the aprons, and the taxiways, which will highlight any cracking, any areas of concern, and any areas of raveling where the aggregate's being lost from the runway. Right. That's a surface condition indicator.
And that's the pavement classification number.
That's right. That's correct. Yeah.
Okay. Now, you mentioned something earlier. You said you said about, you know, preventive maintenance, and what you're talking about there is about the different approaches that different areas take for whatever reasons. But do you find now, coming out of COVID, that organisations and airports particularly are more focused now on risk and hazards, and also contingency and continuity, so that it makes more sense to do something that lasts longer and meets all of the other pressures that businesses are facing now? Or do you think, you know, people are still looking at the short-term approach?
I think it's definitely starting to change. A longer term approach is starting to come in, and that mindset's starting to change. And we've noticed from the inquiries that we've been having and the work that we've been coming up, that is definitely starting to happen. They're starting to become longer term, fixed on longer term, and particularly, I think the years of austerity before that, before COVID as well, have obviously hit hard. So the whole do more with less mentality,
exactly,
has kicked in, and it's definitely changing. It's definitely changing. But the advantages of doing it as well is there's preset programs which allow planned preventative maintenance, and can extend the life of your runway for, as I say, for another 5-10 years without having to do major works and major resurfacing, which is, you know, done at huge cost.
Yeah, exactly, and it makes so much sense. You wonder why everybody's not doing it, but then again, you look at so many programs now, and, you know, preventive maintenance, and people are still not doing it, and it's I just find it amazing. It's a little bit, well, anyhow, it should be addressed. Now, something else that you spoke about, and we had a chat about before we came on the air, was about military and civilian surfaces. Now, I've landed on a few military airports and runways in my time, and had to taxi around, but what is the difference?
Not a huge amount, to be honest. It's still mostly, so military runways tend to be more historic, particularly in the UK. So all our runways, military runways, are generally concrete based, and go back to the wartime, after World War II and after. They're very good at preventative. The MOD here are very good at preventative treatments. So they'll do things like joint sealing, crack repair. Regularly, they'll do asphalt rejuvenation, which extends the life of the runway, and they'll also do surface repairs, and micro asphalt as well, which is like a thin layer of asphalt to improve the friction course where needed. They just have slightly different standards. So the MOD, for us, standards are slightly different, and they're very good at the surface monitoring. I'd say they're ahead of civilian airports on that. But otherwise, material-wise, it's not a huge difference. It's just they have different needs, and particularly in the days when you had like the Harrier jump jets, vertical takeoff. It's different forces that go onto the ground, which will affect the quality of the asphalt and affect how it performs.
Okay, I mean that makes sense. That makes sense. Now, another area that I wanted to ask you about. Obviously, I have walked so much in this 10-12 days where I've been over here, and something that came up, and so obviously for you, you know exactly what it is. It's the PCN survey. So sorry, the PCI, the Pavement Condition Index. But I started to look, I'm thinking, my God, there is so much surface and pavement around every single airport. It's incredible. Now, when you're, I take it that you also deal with what we're calling pavements as pavements, correct?
Yes.
Now, how important is it to have correct pavements? And the reason I'm saying that is because some of the airports I've worked at, when they've done the design, they forgot about, like, you know, the crew, the buses, the way they dip down and hitting into the curb and damage from both sides. And then also with equipment that might reverse or go onto it, etc. But also the importance of making sure that the people who are working there have got a safe surface to walk on and maneuver. You know, how does that come about to be as good as it should be?
Say, when you're designing a new airport, that should be considered at the first step. That's you have to consider every movement.
Logic.
Yeah. For existing airports, it's slightly different because you're working with infrastructure that's old. You have to adapt around it, but it's a difficult challenge for designers because, you know, you've got environmental conditions to worry about, de-icing,
Yep.
Aprons are generally concrete because that's where they fuel the aircraft, and aircraft fuel and asphalt doesn't mix. If you drop spill fuel onto asphalt, it will degrade it, and it will cause it to fail. So you have to make sure that the different materials are selected and chosen correctly, and then treated and looked after properly. And that's where things like PCIs are really useful, because it basically gives you a simple number and color-coded layout that anybody can look at of your apron and runway and taxiways, and you can see straight away where you have issues.
Yeah. So when I said at the beginning, it's a subject matter that you don't straight away think, oh, you know, that'll be, but there's so much that goes into it, isn't there, Campbell?
There is. There's lots of things to think about, and if you're working in, we work all over the world. We work in Europe, the Middle East, Caribbean, and Asia, and you've got different cultures and different materials available, and different quality of construction methods. And one of the things that we do is we're trying to help, particularly in Asia and in the Caribbean, to help them improve their quality control and their construction techniques. And bringing in new technology and training and continual improvement processes to improve the overall ability to construct airfields. We're lucky here in the UK and in Europe, where we have excellent contractors that can fly around the world that know exactly what they're doing, specialized airport teams. That's not the case in some of the bigger countries in the developing world.
Oh, no, I can imagine. Now, this might be a stupid question, and I do apologize ahead of time if it is. But I've also worked in places like Mexico, Joburg, so altitude, and then places like Anchorage and Chicago with the extreme weather conditions. I mean, there must be a huge variance of consideration that goes in there, is there?
There is, yeah. So altitude, not so much, but particularly in cold places, or in places like Chicago and Canada, you've got freeze thaw to worry about. So obviously conditions, how your runway copes with snow, ice, and then the damage it caused with ice expanding and then contracting, because that obviously gets into the texture of the runway and into the texture of the asphalt and the surfacing material, and then causes it to break. And then you've got the extreme heat at the other end, where, you know, if you've got a runway sitting at 65, 70 degrees, you're starting to get to the softening point of the bitumen, which binds and holds the aggregate together. And then you have the other area where you'll start to have stone loss and failures. So it's all got to be considered and carefully considered by the designers. And that's something that we help consult with as well, and making sure that the aggregate that's used is correct and is suitable with the right mix design.
Incredible. I'd imagine you're very busy at the moment, huh?
Yeah, we've got quite a lot on. We do standard testing in the UK, so we've got quite a few friction tests going on here. We're helping a civil aviation authority in Asia at the moment to bring in PCI and what we call a pavement management system, which is PCI, roughness, friction, and HWD. As well as we do a lot of work for F1. So we're working with a couple of tire companies as well to better understand tire surface interaction and how tires perform. And we've got quite a lot on. We're just about to start resurfacing Donington Park circuit as well in the UK. So
nice. So you might be influencing the secret ingredient in next year's events.
Well, maybe we work for F1's technical department themselves, so we help them with understanding surfaces and tire surface interaction. And I say we work with a few other customers that I'm not allowed to talk about.
I can imagine. Now, listen, it would be remiss of me not to mention that shirt in the background over your right shoulder. So for people that are watching, they probably won't understand the history or what it meant. But my God, what an achievement that team had for those couple of years, huh?
Yeah, that's my Dundee United shirt. Unfortunately for my sins, I'm a Dundee United fan. So as well as watching F1, I'm regularly watching Dundee United play terribly at the moment. But that's Christian Daly's shirt from the first time we won the Scottish Cup.
Incredible.
After 7 attempts.
Yeah, but it's always there, memories and a little bit of history there as well, huh?
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you think it'll ever be repeated?
No, I don't think we'll. I don't
No.
think, unfortunately, not. No, I don't think we'll see the likes of Aberdeen beating Real Madrid in a European Cup final again. Unfortunately, it's a different
Wasn't
game
that
now.
incredible?
Money's just changed everything.
Yeah, as it does in so many ways.
That's
But for
true.
anybody who needs to watch something that's really interesting, they should watch the Alex Ferguson biography or biopic, whatever you want to call it. Absolutely fantastic viewing, brilliant. The man and also the achievement, and it reminded me a little bit of Brian Clough with Nottingham
Yeah,
Forest.
yeah, that's right. There was Brian Clough, Alex Ferguson, and Jim McLean, who was Dundee United's manager, and they in the 80s, basically tore up the rule book on how to do it and how to play and beat these massive
Yeah,
teams with. Well, we were always called a corner shop team. Yeah, small
yeah.
provincial clubs taking on the might of the European giants. It was incredible.
Oh, it really was, really was. But it also shows, nothing's impossible. Now we've come to the end of it. I've really enjoyed, honestly, Campbell. Not only have I enjoyed it because of the coincidences, but generally I've enjoyed it. And like I said, I'm going to be looking at it very, very differently now when I get back on the tarmac tomorrow. But also the R3 being roads, runways, and racetracks. I think you could also say it's also reliable, resilient, and respected. So I think what you're doing is a great job, and fair play to you. And thanks for giving us a window into a world that most people wouldn't even think of at the moment. But it's so important in this aviation industry. So really appreciate your time, my friend.
Well, thanks very much, Chris. I really appreciate you having me on the podcast. I'm a big fan of it, and it's been really nice to talk to you.